Welcome into a very special bracket recap edition of Three True Values. I'm your host, James Fletcher, and we are coming to you on a Sunday night, a rare time for us to record, but we had to get in here right after the selection committee reveals their bracket. We're going to talk through what happened, what the field looks like now heading into the NCAA tournament. This will not be a multi-segment show. This is not going to be a super long podcast, but what we're going to do is approach this from kind of a bracketology standpoint. We're going to look at my field, look at what the committee did, and we're going to kind of compare them, weigh it, what I like that they did, where I might have a couple of issues with the field, how it is seeded, and we're just going to go through what it looks like, the teams that we have in the field, the matchups that we're going to see. On Tuesday is when we are going to do bracket picks. We're going to go through the full field, 4 segments. We're going to take you all the way through it and do for both matchups through the weekend. We're going to predict the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. So be sure to come back for bracket picks on Tuesday. There'll also be a written version of that at On3. You can find out who I'm riding with in my bracket, who I'm selecting to advance to the next round. But we do have a field of 68 teams now. March Madness is officially here. The selection committee has seeded them. And so we've got the overall seed line and, of course, what the field ultimately looks like. And as we go ahead and jump into it, we knew who the 1 seeds were going to be. We got Duke, Michigan, Arizona, and Florida. Now, the only debate that we have here is Arizona jumping Michigan. Now, in my final bracketology update, I did lean with Michigan standing at the number 2 overall seed. Looked at those resumes and thought that Michigan just had barely enough, maybe not to hold off Arizona. I do think that ultimately, if I was in the room and I was among those making decisions, I probably would have been in the camp of let's put Arizona above Michigan. The reason that in my final bracketology I did keep Michigan above Arizona is how late in the process the loss came. We know that, yes, they do take everything into account. And I think that this bracket, and we'll touch on it a couple of places, really shows you that they wanted to send a message. There's been talk for years that they don't really watch what happens on Sunday, or maybe they watch it, but they don't take it into account because this field was already seeded. We know that on Saturday they had seeded the top 8 lines. They had already figured out what that was going to look like. Those top 32 teams, they had them all in order. But they give themselves the opportunity to, as they say, scrub that data. And when they scrub the data, yes, you can end up with a team moving up a spot or 2 here, down a spot or 2 there. But ultimately, what we have seen in the past, more often than not, is very little movement from what we knew coming into the day. And so for Michigan to drop below Arizona, I think is a message by this selection committee that they do value every data point. They were going to watch all the way down to the wire, and they did decide that head to head, those 2 resumes, they were close enough that Arizona was going to jump Michigan in the contingency bracket. They were going to get that 2nd overall seed. I went back and forth on it. I really did during that Michigan game even. When it looked like Purdue might win by a big margin, I did think you would have to account for that and put Arizona on the 2 seed line. Like I said, if I was in the room myself making decisions, I probably would have been in that camp. But I did ultimately land with a close loss. I did not know if it was going to harm them enough to push them below Arizona. It ultimately did. And so we've got Duke, Arizona, Michigan, and Florida. As I said for weeks now, though, did not really impact anything other than the bragging rights, other than the way the rest of the field was seated below them. Duke heads to Greenville. We knew that was going to happen. Florida is in Tampa below them on that side of the bracket. Of course, we've got Arizona heading to San Diego. They're in the West. And then in the Midwest, Michigan will go through Buffalo. On the 2 seed line. Now, this is where things, we did nail it with bracketology. We had Houston as the 5th overall seed. They jumped UConn over the course of the weekend. Yes, they both took a loss in their conference championship game, but UConn with a blowout loss to a St. John's team, where Houston took a closer loss against an Arizona team. That's a much Better loss to put on your resume. It did ultimately drop UConn down a spot. Houston also, throughout the course of the Big 12 tournament, did see some of their analytics continue to climb up and go just a bit higher as things continued. We then had from there a debate about UConn. We had a conversation about Houston and Iowa State. All of those, or excuse me, we knew where Houston would be, but it was Purdue who ends up securing their spot on the 2 seed line. Again, Keith Gill confirms that the last game of the day did hold weight. It did matter when they seeded this field. Purdue, he said, was on the 3 seed line until they scrubbed things and they were moved into the 2 seed conversation. And so Purdue makes its way onto the 2 seed line with Iowa State and UConn. Houston, of course, also there. On the 3 seed line, this is the first place where we missed on a team. Michigan State comes out as the top 3 seed. We know, of course, that Virginia and Illinois were in the mix, but Nebraska does not find its way on the 3 seed line. Now, this kind of added up. If you looked at the analytics, if you looked at the raw numbers, they did ultimately fall to the 4 seed line. But the reason that I ultimately decided to keep them on the 3 seed line in my edition of bracketology is that when games had stopped being played, when Nebraska's season was done, when, for example, we'll talk about Gonzaga, they were the team that ultimately got the last 3 seed. Nebraska had an advantage when we looked at it. And then through the rest of the games that were played, through matchups of teams that they faced that impact their analytics, that impact their data, they did fall a little bit over the last couple of days and end up looking more like a 4 seed team than a 3 seed team. But I decided, since those resumes were both complete, I was going to leave Nebraska above Gonzaga. That is not how the committee saw it. I do think that Gonzaga, with their analytics, was a very real 3 seed candidate. They did really add up, and it makes sense why they put them there. So no real issues with that one. And we moved to the 4 seed line where we know Nebraska was. Alabama also in that mix. Arkansas gets the nod after winning the SEC title on Sunday afternoon. Vanderbilt, though, slips to the 5 seed line. I had Vanderbilt in on the 4 seed line. Really strong analytics down the stretch. Really impressive as we got deeper and deeper into the weekend. But Kansas gets the final spot. That one was a bit of a head scratcher for me. This is probably my biggest complaint with the entire NCAA tournament field. If we were going to go through what I could pick and choose to rant about. In this conversation, I think that it ultimately came down to Vanderbilt, Kansas, and St. John's. I do think that both Vanderbilt and St. John's were better candidates for this 4 seed spot than Kansas was. I think that St. John's, as the Big East regular season and conference tournament champion, with wins over UConn in the regular season and in the postseason, I thought that that was a really strong case to make a jump onto the 4 seed line. Vanderbilt, like I said, their analytics had really gone up to almost the 3 seed conversation. They were bordering, heading into Sunday's game, on a situation where if they won, I thought that they could make a case to jump to the 3 seed line. Probably wasn't going to be enough to get them there, but it was something that was in play that I was at least monitoring as I scrubbed the data. And so for them to land on the 5 seed line is a little bit of a head scratcher. But again, if you had told me that it was St. John's that got the nod over them, I would have understood. I do think, though, that Vanderbilt ultimately probably, with the analytics, came out ahead of Alabama. I can understand why you would still put Alabama ahead of them in the seed line if you came down to those two and were arguing. But still, I cannot get to Kansas. I did not think that they were the top 5 seed available to take that spot, but they land ultimately in the top 16 overall seeds. When we come back on the other side, we'll go through the bracket, what it does look like. We'll break down where everyone stands, and we'll talk through it right here on 3 True Values. Welcome back in here as we wrap up today's show. We're going to go through the full field just so you have an idea of where everyone stands. We'll start in the East region where Duke takes on Siena, and Ohio State takes on TCU. Both those games will be played in Greenville, South Carolina. St. John's plays Northern Iowa. Kansas taking on Cal Baptist. Those games will happen in San Diego. Louisville will take on South Florida. Michigan State against North Dakota State up in Buffalo. We also have UCLA, UCF, and then UConn Furman rounds out the first round matchups. Those games taking place in Philadelphia. That is your East region. And below them in the South region, Florida is the number one overall seed. They will play the winner of the play-in game against Prairie View, A&M, and Lehigh. Clemson and Iowa are the 8-9 game there in the Tampa region. I will be there for those games with live coverage for On3. Vanderbilt takes on McNeese, and Nebraska up against Troy there in the South region once again. North Carolina, VCU is the 6-11 game. Illinois taking on Penn in the 3-14 matchup. St. Mary's taking on Texas A&M. Houston against Idaho. And that rounds out your South region. Those bottom games, of course, taking place in Oklahoma City. So is the Nebraska led games there in the 4-5. And Illinois will be headed to Greenville. We look now to the other side of the bracket. In the West, we have Arizona taking on LIU, Villanova against Utah State. Those will take place in San Diego as well. Wisconsin taking on High Point in the 5-12 game. Arkansas against Hawaii in the 4-13. Those games will take place in Portland. BYU against the winner of Texas and NC State. This is part of the last four in. We'll talk just a bit about that here in a moment. And the 3-14 game is Gonzaga, Kennesaw State. Those also in Portland. So San Diego, Portland to start here in the West region. They at least have it geographically right to this point. Miami takes on Missouri in the 7-10 game, and Purdue faces Queens, who is in their first year of eligibility to make the NCAA tournament out of the A-Sun. Those games take place in St. Louis. So again, they stayed pretty far to the west in the West region. Pretty good slate there. And below them on that side of the bracket, we have the Midwest, where Michigan is your number one seed, UMBC or Howard, the winner in the first four, which will be played in Dayton. Georgia versus St. Louis below them. Those games taking place in Buffalo. Texas Tech is the 5 seed taking on Akron, while Alabama will face Hofstra again in Tampa. I will have coverage of those games. 6 seed Tennessee will face Miami, Ohio, or SMU, two more last four in teams, which we will be discussing here momentarily. Virginia against Wright State in the 3-14 matchup. These games will all be in Philadelphia. Kentucky, Santa Clara in the 7-10, and Iowa, Tennessee State. Those games in St. Louis. That wraps up your field of 68. We now have the teams set out as they are, and we do know that the last four teams into the field matching up, Miami, Ohio against SMU. That's a really interesting one. Two teams that we had in the last four in. They, of course, get the nod, as we predicted. Miami, Ohio, of course, undefeated regular season. That was enough to give them the edge. They were not the last team in the field. They did make it, though, into the last four in here as we sort through where everyone stands. It was interesting as it came down to the wire. The final teams that got into the field, you had Miami, Ohio as 44. VCU at 45 is interesting because it implies that they probably would not have made the field if they did not win against Dayton in Sunday's A-10 championship. SMU also in there at 43. NC State against Texas is the other first four in matchup. And now, as I'm looking at the overall seed line as we're recording, I'm noticing that although it was said by the selection committee that Miami, Ohio was not the last team in, they are the last team here among those which were at-large teams. So either a miscommunication or the seed line that was sent out is incorrect there. But regardless, as we talk through this, as we break things down, NC State against Texas, that is your other play-in game on the 11 seed line. And this one's fascinating because Texas, yes, we had as the last team in the field. Of course, the selection committee had them above SMU, which is interesting. Went back and forth with that a little bit down the stretch, but ultimately landed with Texas below based on SMU's injuries and the fact that they would be getting their star player, BJ Edwards, back, but don't really have any serious issue with those teams slated the way that they are. NC State, though, interesting to see them fall down here to the 11 seed line, and here's why. NC State, it was judged in the eyes of the selection committee that their wins against Clemson and SMU both were tainted by injuries, that those two teams both were lacking some of their significant contribution, and therefore they did not get the full weight of those wins. They were kind of capped and brought back down below Texas A&M, below Missouri, who both make it into the field without having to go through Dayton. Interesting to see, too, that Missouri landed above Texas A&M. That one is a little bit head-scratching to me. Not enough to really go out there, but I did have Texas A&M more solidly in the field than Missouri, looking through the numbers and how those two teams stacked up. When you looked at the analytics, when you looked at various other categories, the resume metrics, it really just seemed like Texas A&M had a little bit more cushion than Missouri did. That's not, however, the case. Santa Clara, a team that I saw popularly put into the last four in, they finished 37th, so they were the top 10 seed actually as things stood. That lined up much closer to how I had it in my field coming into the day and also exiting the day as we finished bracketology with our final projections, which did perform pretty well. I'll give you just a couple of little data points here. We ultimately had 54 of the 68 teams placed on the correct seed line. Those 14 other ones, each were only one seed line off. So nobody significantly off, just a few flipped here and there throughout the bracket. Also, 6 exact matchups that will be played were correctly predicted. 21 of the teams were correctly placed and correctly placed within the correct region. So we had everything right on over a fourth of the field, almost just right under a third of the field we had in the exact correct position as it came down. And of course, that number would have probably been significantly higher had we flipped Arizona and Michigan. That would have, of course, done a lot for the seeding in those. We would have, on the top 4 seeds, done just a little bit better, but that's all right. That's how this game works. Excited to come back and do this again next year. More bracketology is on the way. We will have better predictions. Hopefully we land 68 out of 68 teams. That, of course, is the most important metric to talk about. I can't forget to throw that stat in there. No teams were missed this year. This is, of course, after hitting on 67 of the 68 teams last year in bracketology. So only one team we have missed over the last 2 seasons. If you include the first season that I did bracketology, where I kind of jumped in midway through the season, figured it out, we also got 67 correct in that year. So only 2 teams that we have missed on over the past 3 seasons. So you want to know what's going on. You want to know what teams are going to be in the field. Check out bracketology at On3. I will have all the latest. We're even going to do way too early bracketology here in the not too distant future. Get you ready for what to expect next year in the NCAA tournament. But we're going to go through the NCAA tournament, the actual NCAA tournament. We're going to play it out on the hardwood first. We'll be back on Tuesday with bracket picks. We'll be back on Thursday with some more analysis on the top players, the top teams, upset candidates that are on deck. And then on Friday, I will have coverage Sunday as well from Tampa for you. Plenty of games there. Hopefully going to have a few feature stories from coaches, players, things that are going on around the arena. So be sure to check out all of that. Come back here for the podcast. Go check out my work at On3. Follow me at JDFletch3. If you don't on Twitter, that's where I post all of my stuff that I am promoting. And join us again. Thank you, everyone, for following out along throughout this entire season. We got plenty more coverage for you right here on 3 True Values.